Sonny, thank you so much for taking the time, first of all, to speak to us. To introduce myself quickly, I'm Jana. I'm working for Global Citizen, which is a non-governmental organization with a headquarters in New York, but we also have an office in Germany, in Berlin, and that's where I'm based. Since we're pretty much interested in human rights too, I have the pleasure today to interview you. And would like to start with the first question, and this is, when I watched the movie or the documentary From Here, there was a scene in that film where you saw a white woman at the street at a demonstration or protest. I think she was holding kind of a sign, and that was basically saying, "We want our country back." And I think that was a really interesting moment in that film, and it's basically an ongoing issue that is happening in the States, but also in other places that people claim like, we want our country back. So I was just wondering, how did you feel about this, and how did you feel in this situation, and how do you handle those situations in general?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. That was several years back when there was a proposed Islamic Cultural Center and mosque to be built in Lower Manhattan, and a lot of right-wing and mostly white people from the suburbs came into New York City and caused a big fuss around it, saying basically Muslims are taking over at ground zero, and connecting it to 9/11 and disrespect. So totally ridiculous. So the reason I was there was to stand in solidarity with the Muslim community. And to say no to hatred and bigotry and Islamophobia, which are things that, have always been a part of my life, things I've always experienced. But in the last decade or more, now we're talking almost 2 decades since 9/11, a lot of the things that bubbled beneath the surface have just become so much more in your face in this country, and as you mentioned, in lots of parts of the world. I think there's this sense from some people, particularly some white people in this country, that this is inherently their land, their country, and the rest of us are a threat to them, right? And of course, that's what Donald Trump's entire campaign and political career has been built on. That's what is behind the slogan "Make America Great Again." So, although that scene you're talking about was during the Obama presidency, it very much, that sort of far-right racist ideology is very much what's driving the Trump campaign and the Trump sort of agenda. So unfortunately, I think we're only seeing that growing here in the United States, as people like me, people like us who care about human rights and social justice, get our voices out there more and more, gain more visibility in popular culture, in elected, in municipal and state and federal government as well. This small minority of sort of white nationalist, white supremacist people are getting louder and louder because they feel like they're under threat. And I think that's a dynamic that's happening all over the world.
You are a protagonist of this film From Here. You basically decided to share a lot of your experience, a lot of your private life, a lot of your feelings. So why did you decide to do that, and why do you feel like this is important?
Yeah, it's true. I was followed around by Christina and her camera for many years. And, part of it was I had a really good rapport with the director. I felt a lot of trust with her. So I sort of knew my story would be sort of honored and treated with the utmost respect by her. And that if there was anything that I didn't want to be in the film, ultimately, I would be able to tell her and she would respect my wishes. So we had that kind of relationship. So that made me feel a lot safer about it. And, I just don't think, and the reason that I agreed to it in a broader sense was that I don't think there's many stories like mine that are told in films, whether it's documentary or fiction films in the United States, but also in Europe and other parts of the world, even in India, right? The way that Sikh characters are portrayed in the media is very stereotypical, very negative, very caricatured. So for me, it feels like a responsibility as someone who is a pretty outwardly facing activist and musician, to tell my story out there, and young people hearing those stories, for example, that allows them to perhaps, and I've gotten this feedback, that allows them to be more likely to then share their own stories and begin to activate and transform their own lives for the better. And I think about what it was like to grow up here in the United States. Without those stories, not only Sikh and South Asian stories, but just stories of people who are experiencing things similar to what I was experiencing, the kind of bullying, the kind of harassment, the kind of isolation, which is something that so many communities experience, right? Whether it's based on race, whether it's based on sexual orientation, right? These are things that many of us experience, and I think it's just so important for us to share these stories.
How did your life actually change through the film and the documentary? I assume you got some more attention. So what changed for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a public. I don't know if persona is the right word, but I've been quite public about my opinions and ideas, and obviously my music for quite a while. So there wasn't a huge transformation in that sense, but every once in a while, I'll hear from somebody who's seen it. Not too many people have seen it because it's only played at one film festival before this one. So I think the question will be interesting to see, if the film eventually gets distribution and is seen by lots and lots and lots of people, which I hope that it is. But I'm proud of the story that Christina tells of me.
Were there any kind of feelings or experiences like during the film that you felt like, wait, this is an interesting angle, I haven't thought about it before?
To me, what the most powerful thing about the film is, and watching it as someone who's in it, is the way that our four stories, the four protagonists, are woven together, and the parallels are just so striking. And to me, that's what's so unique and compelling about this film. Rarely do you hear the stories, as I already said, of a Sikh person in the United States, a Bolivian person in the United States of Bolivian descent who is undocumented, a German Vietnamese person, a Roma person in Germany, right? Rarely do you hear any of these stories as individual stories, but the way that our stories are so in sync with each other and the recurring themes, to me, that's the aha moment for me as I watch it,
Another strong statement you made in this film was the desire, when you said, like, when you were a kid, you had that desire to be white. And I feel like, unfortunately, this is not the first time I'm hearing this. And that's something that makes me really sad, that we are living in a society where people feel like being white is better in a sense. And when did it stop for you? When was the point where you accepted and realized that's not what I want to be?
I agree with you that it's all too common of a sentiment for a lot of kids of color, and maybe even some adults who are dealing with those pretty traumatic kind of manifestations of internalized racism. So I obviously internalized that a lot when I was a kid, and it wasn't really until I don't know exactly when I was consciously feeling that way and when it was more of an unconscious feeling, but I know a big turning point in my life was when I was 16 years old. I was lucky enough to go to this camp, actually, that focused on social justice issues, that focused on anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-violence kind of discussions and trainings with peers, other high school students in Arizona, where I was living. And that experience completely transformed my outlook, because it was the first time where I felt really sort of seen and heard and accepted by my peers. And then it was also the first time where I began to connect, as I said, similar to what I was saying about watching the film, where I began to connect the isolation, bullying, and harassment that I was experiencing with what was happening to other communities. And so I started seeing that common struggle and that common enemy of oppression. And then I really left that experience at 16, feeling like fighting for justice, fighting against hatred, fighting against racism and sexism, and other forms of oppression was sort of the mission of my life. And thus my own sense of identity really began to shift as well. And I began to feel more pride in who I was and in my people. And I wanted to learn more about my people and my spiritual traditions and my cultural background. And it was a huge turning point.
There was also the statement you made saying you are, or feeling safe is not that common for you. What gives you that feeling of not being or feeling safe, and what do you usually fear the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think for many of us who have experienced the traumas of racism or sexism or homophobia, and for many people, all three, you know, yeah, safety can be a little bit elusive, right? And so for me, I'm not necessarily in my daily life in New York City fearing for my physical safety. But I've experienced things in this city that were deeply traumatic, right? Like I think I talked about it in the film, my turban being pulled off on the subway. And so it's very difficult for me to ride on a crowded subway and not feel that experience in my body. So even without thinking about it consciously, I feel it in my body, and it's something that fades a little bit with time. But then another sort of horrible racist event happens to me or to somebody that looks like me, or even someone who doesn't look like me. But there's a connection that I can draw, and then that brings it back to that sort of emotional level. That's very hard. That's very hard to control, right? More often than not, the way this looks is the way people stare at me, right? The looks that I get, and occasionally, and sometimes more frequent than occasional, the comments that people make or the things people yell at me. And these things, some days it's in one ear, out the other, and I can just let it go. And some days, just depending on my kind of mental and emotional state, it really sticks, and it really kind of ruins my day. And I can only imagine what people that have experienced, more extreme forms of oppressive violence than I have, and even ancestral violence. The way that they walk with that in their bodies, I cannot even imagine.
You mentioned violence, and I obviously been thinking about like the Black Lives Matter protests right now. And this basically is not a new form of racism or discrimination that's going on for a long time, but it's a momentum right now. And how do you feel about that? How is that right now for you living in the US and seeing these protests?
The protests and the massive uprising in the US and around the world right now in defense and in support of Black lives and against structural racism, particularly in policing, but really this is becoming something far beyond racist policing that this movement is confronting. To me, is deeply, deeply inspiring and uplifting, and I support it wholeheartedly. From my perspective as a South Asian and a Sikh, is these moments are times for reflection within our own communities. Right? These are times not only for us to be externally on the streets and confronting, racist systems and racist policing, and being out there and putting our bodies in the line if we're able to do that. But it's also a time to, have these conversations with our aunties and uncles who make racist comments, right? To engage our parents in these conversations, our cousins in these conversations, go to our community centers, our gurdwaras. Maybe those are virtual things right now, given the pandemic. But, I think this issue of anti-Black racism in particular is one that is insidious in all non-Black communities, and immigrant communities like my own are no exception. Anti-Black racism has really deep roots in South Asia. My parents had ideologies of anti-Black racism before they ever even immigrated to the United States, right? And those are things that they taught me. And so a reckoning is deeply, deeply needed, that we really have that internal work to do. And I think this uprising is a good conversation starter to really be challenging these dynamics that run so deep.
My last question is basically, you touched on that, but I really wonder, what would you advise, or what's your wish for young people and basically everyone around the world? How should we change our behavior to overcome those things and to eliminate discrimination in that sense?
To me, one of the most effective starting points is reflection, reflecting on your own identities, asking yourself what are the ways in which I receive privileges and benefits based on my race, my religion, my gender, my sexuality, my class, my ability or disability, and what are the ways where I've been targeted, right? What are the ways that I've been disadvantaged by these things about myself, and really taking stock of our own experiences and having honest conversations about them. These are deeply, deeply personal issues that affect all of us, regardless of our identities. And I would say to white people when it comes to racism, to cisgender men when it comes to sexism, this is our work to do. You know, for people who have privilege bear an extra responsibility to be unlearning the biases, unlearning the oppressive behaviors and patterns and ideologies that we've been socialized into. And that's on us to do that work. And that really begins with deep, deep and honest reflection and talking to our people, right? So that means white people talking to other white people about racism and calling out oppressive behaviors and entitlement and privilege that's taken up in spaces that's really the responsibility, the primary responsibility of white people to begin to challenge that. Just like I see it as my responsibility to be challenging other cisgender men around behaviors that perpetuate sexism and patriarchy and misogyny. Right? These systems can't continue without the sort of passive. Well, I think it's largely passive. Sometimes it's more active participation of people in privilege, right? So when we're talking about racism, the passive and well-meaning participation in racist systems and behaviors by well-meaning white people. So I think to me that's the starting point. The ending point, the sky is the limit. I'm deeply inspired by this moment, and also it's a moment of really intersectional activism. The Black Lives Matter movement is not looking at race in a bubble, right? The Black Lives Matter movement is looking at race as a part of a broader structure connected to gender justice, connected to trans justice, connected to queer liberation, connected to anti-capitalist struggles. And these are the dots we have to connect, I think, if we really want a better world.
Thanks for taking the time.
Of course. Thanks for having me.